All right. So this is going to sound like a weird question, but I have to ask, have you ever been in danger? And the reason why I ask this question is because there are certain things that when you're in those situations, you just pay attention to, or that just become really evident. You know, those moments when your senses are dialed all the way up and your eyes begin to dart from one dark shadow to another, thinking everything you're hearing is a threat. And, well, none of that happened here, yet I was so close to danger. I was so close to it that by the time I knew it, I was already caught up. Let me explain. I've already mentioned that Leti needed help understanding what happened to her that night at Bastion's party when she revived him by humming. The night we recreated what happened, myself, Leti, and Sahara, it went something like this. By the way, I'm still trying to figure it all out. I mean, I know what happened, but it's one of those things where knowing still doesn't really mean you understand. I know, it's confusing, but follow me. That night, it changed me forever. It was, if I was to compare it to something, just because of everything that was happening, it was like listening to the perfect song, which happens to also be the saddest song you've ever heard. Do you know what I'm talking about? You know, that song where it speaks to you through time and space, but it can only happen like that for an instant, just an instant. Once it's over, you sit back and you relish in it. You kind of sit in it, even though it wrecks your spirit. You sit in disbelief that it hit you so hard. Then, against what you know will happen, you try to recreate it again, but it doesn't hit the same because the effect was just there for that one fixed moment in time, which then makes you savor the memory of it even more. Do you know what I'm talking about? Am I making sense? It's not just about the song, but it's about what it did in that moment. How everything about it just resonated with you. The beat, the lyrics, the voice, the cadence, everything just worked harmoniously, meeting you at that exact point in your life where it would mean the most. That's how I felt. That's the beginning of being changed. That's how I still feel. My life was set on a whole different course after that night. And Leti, well, she wouldn't be the same either. Not even close. Okay, so after that night, when Leti first told me about what had happened, I went home. I didn't really get what her experience was, but I believe that she had it. Like, I didn't really understand it, but I believe it really happened to her. The following day, she came back with the receipts. She put her friend Ayana on the phone to tell me her perspective. Then I had the chance to talk to Bastion, who was knee deep in album promo mode, but definitely didn't sound like someone who recently had a near-death experience. I don't know if something like that even slows down an artist. It seems par for the course at this point, but with everything that happened to bring him to where he was, I thought there'd at least be some signal that, yeah, hey man, I almost died, but that's neither here nor there. Both Iana and Bastion shared what they thought happened that night, and even though I heard it from them, it was still a mess in terms of understanding what happened. But it did provide new information on what would be helpful later in understanding Leti's phenomenon. Iana said that she lost time, that she ended her call with 911 at 11:07, but that when she turned back around to Leti, it was 11:12. 5 minutes were just gone. She thought it could have been the adrenaline, or maybe she misremembered the time, but she felt really confident about losing those 5 minutes. With Bastian, he mentioned that as he started to wake up, he heard Leti's voice in his head. Iana said that she experienced something very similar, that her hum filled his head. Not like he was listening to loud music with headphones on, but like the sound was actually coming from the inside of his head, in the center of his brain, and that it was all around him at the same time. That he even mentioned that if you could put your ear to his ear at that moment, you would actually hear the music or Leti's voice ebbing out of his ear. He also said that once he was awake, he could feel vibrations. His head was in Leti's lap. She was like cradling him, and it felt like her ribs were vibrating like a tuning fork, and that there was a pitch of some sort to those reverberations, like a certain note. He recalled being able to feel those vibrations through his entire body. That same thing didn't happen with Iana, so my guess was that Bastian's proximity to Leti altered his experience slightly. Also, they both mentioned feeling different after the experience, that they both had more energy, felt less sluggish, and more alert. This had a greater effect on Bastian, who had the blood work of someone who was 10 years younger than him. Even Iana felt better than she had ever felt. She used to be an espresso addict by her own admission, and since that night, she hadn't needed a sip of coffee unless she craved the taste of it. And even then, she had become extremely sensitive to its caffeine. So, what I learned and why these things are important is that whatever happened that night, nobody who had been in that room left the same way. Oh, and I mentioned in the previous episode of this story that Bastian had OD'd. And I want to make it clear that the OD wasn't his fault, not entirely. You know, this was a guy who barely drank, let alone smoked, or participated in any other substances. You know, it was a festive occasion. His debut album was on the cusp of release. His girlfriend Leti had, made this party for him, so he was just really excited, and then someone passed him a strain, and it happened to be laced with fentanyl, and that's what almost killed him. So I wanted to make sure that was clear for the record and why he ended up in the condition that he was in. All right, so when we finally recreated what Leti experienced, it was a Wednesday night. I had gone upstairs to the Arboretum Cafe for a mid-session coffee. Let me go ahead and set the scene for you. The sky outside was going from purple to navy with orange streaks. It was the sun's farewell touch for the day. College students were walking past excitedly or in hushed tones, many heading to local bars or coffee shops to either shake off the stress of their studies or to put more on. I enjoyed seeing them go about their evening, hyper conscious of the world they lived in, but still allowing themselves to be kids who had dreams and aspirations. Also, it was wild that they had no idea that several feet underground, through layers of concrete and steel, there were things on a near science fiction level happening right below them. That was the real trip. Okay, so after getting a few drinks, I made my way back down to the studio. I had one coffee for myself and 2 special yerba mate cups in hand for Leti and Sahara. Because, I'm a considerate guy. I didn't even need to go to the Williamstead Martin Academy either. And if you don't get that joke, you'll just have to listen to Javia's story. Anyways, I'm back in the studio, and the LED ceiling panels around the room cast the same blue, purple, and now fiery red hues gently around the room. That was actually one of the best things about the studio, because even though we'd be down in the studio for hours, we'd still have a sense of the passage of time. It was helpful to not feel like our days were just going endlessly into oblivion. The moment I came back into the room, though, it was not how I left it. Leti and Sahara were having this heated exchange. I am talking about heated. The streaks of flames in the LED panels paled to what was happening between the two of them. And it wasn't even that it was just loud, it was intense. You never wanted me to do this. Why don't you believe me? Leti shouted. She paced on the other side of my workstation where I worked on the algorithm. Now, Sahara could get expressive when she wanted to, but it's when you're on her last nerve or she has made up her mind about something that she gets into the super scientific, analytical, brass tacks kind of tone. That tone that just reeks of condescension because she's right exactly when you don't want her to be. It's not that. It's just, what if this was just a weird thing? You had a glass of sangria. Could it have had more than just wine in it, especially after what happened with Bastion? We've been at this for a few days now and we haven't found anything. That's all I'm saying. I'm just saying we haven't found anything and I'm wondering if there's anything here. The look on Leti's face told you that Sahara's words ruffled all her feathers. She went slack-jawed for a split second before dragging me into the conversation. You believe me, right? She directed towards me. Maybe we just haven't gotten there yet, right? Leti then pivoted back to Sahara. How are you so sure that we've tried everything? She walked over to the mixer. She was no stranger to a mixer, but the studio setup wouldn't be seen in mainstream recording studios for, I don't know, another 5 to 7 years, maybe even longer. And you could just tell Leti could only make out a few things on it. Shoot, even I barely understood a couple things on it. Leti's shoulders slumped as she stared at the mixer, sadness consuming her anger. She let out a sigh, a heavy one. There has to be more we can do. She kind of like braced herself against the mixer. It wasn't the stupid sangria. I know what happened was real. And if you don't believe me, then I'll figure something else out. Find the next person who's overdosing and hum. Sahara finished. Oof. I took an unconscious step back. You remember that song? Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. Yeah, well, I suspected something bad was about to happen and bodies may drop. Even though Sahara's tone was more curious than mocking, it was the fact that she said it out loud like that. Even if Leti started it by going low, Sahara didn't need to meet her there. Whatever was left of Leti's confidence was quickly emaciated. She tensed, you could see it in her shoulders, and sharply inhaled. Something of a sob was quickly caught behind her lips. We all stood there, silence. My coffee now being kept warm by my hands that were now thoroughly heated from the exchange. Okay, so now, to be honest, somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this conversation was gonna happen sooner or later if we didn't have any results. We had already been at the work for over a week by that point. We had been putting in 7 to 8 hour days, sometimes even longer, having Leti go through melodies, harmonies, singing, humming, riffing, anything that would give us a signal or a direction to what had happened that night. We had a barrage of equipment. Let me tell you something. We had all of the technologies to pick up any frequency, no matter how faint. Sahara even had this crazy looking microphone. I had never seen anything like it in my entire life. It was a glass and wire mesh apparatus that had 3 megaphone looking conical arrays organized in a half circle with 2 large cables from the back of each microphone connected directly to this large black trunk with a semi-reflective surface that only had a few LED indicators and a massive Freon cooling unit at its base. This thing was so specific that it could isolate sonic signatures between the charges of electrons in the air. It was a ridiculously sensitive piece of technology. So much so that the recording booth was basically turned into an airlock and had to be treated differently. Leti could only be in the booth for a maximum of 5 minutes before she would have to come back out. That's how disorienting being in the booth was. There was only so much air that could be inside of it. But the fidelity it produced was unlike anything that I had ever heard. It was basically like LASIK for your ears. You could hear frequencies that only certain species on the planet could tolerate. So imagine that we had all of this technology and we still couldn't figure out what happened. And well, yeah, of course, Sahara was ready to call it. And actually, to be for real, Sahara was really ready to call it after day 3, but it was Leti's optimism that kept her pressing forward. I could understand Sahara's scientific mind. There were only anecdotal accounts of what happened and nothing to suggest or even point us in the right direction of recreating what had happened. So it kind of made sense why she was letting Leti know what she was thinking. I just didn't think it would happen like how it was going down. Leti, I'm sorry, Sahara mentioned. Hey, are you okay? Leti's shoulders began to tremble and it sounded like she couldn't catch her breath. It was a panic attack. Sahara jumped up from her chair, made her way over to Leti, and while Leti offered a shrug for Sahara to back up off her, Sahara held on firmly and guided her to the recording booth. I thought this was crazy, but you know how people who can't catch their breath have to breathe into a brown paper bag? Well, the booth was Leti's paper bag. Once she was in there, Sahara pressurized it and coached Leti from the outside. Leti, breathe slowly, in and out. After a few breaths, my workstation lit up. I'm talking screen on, waveforms galore, red, blue, green, all the colors, breaking down each frequency threshold and notes detected. A flat, B minor, G major, then converting those outputs into variables I could use in my algorithm. And then that's when I heard it. The most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It filled the room like honey tincture tea. It warmed the inside of my ear. It was the most perfect melody. I could feel it spreading from the center of my mind into my ears, over my head, and wash over me like a shower of harmonies. Nothing, and I mean nothing, existed for me except for the euphoria of the song. These words barely do it justice, if I'm being honest with you. There was an ease, an effortlessness paired with an airiness, the exhilaration of being nothing but myself, broken down and distilled like a finely aged whiskey, sipped slowly, affecting every sense. And at the center of it, it wasn't a person, but a will, the desire of someone, something. It was their glass that I filled. And whatever they wanted, whatever she wanted, I would gladly give without question. Because what was a question in a moment like this where I was so completely at peace, whole, not a confluence of experiences, but simply shrouded in singular focus and desire, folded neatly into a place where the word limit had no definition. And as soon as it had begun, the experience was over. I was back on Earth, back in the studio, back in my own body, my face wet with tears. It took a few seconds for me to even remember who I was, what my name was, where I was. That's when I saw Sahara pulling Leti out of the recording booth. Limp. I ran over. She was breathing, but her breaths were shallow. Sahara told me to put her on the couch on the other end of the room. I carry her over, the euphoria somewhere still in the back of my mind, but now is being replaced with a strange throb. It wasn't painful, but it was uncomfortable, like someone reached in and squeezed the base of my brain. Then the panic finds me. I looked to Sahara and tell her that we have to call an ambulance. I figured the panic attack had gotten the best of Leti. But Sahara doesn't say a thing. In fact, she was frustrated, or at least that's what I thought at first. She was actually frightened and angrily simultaneously. But Sahara didn't say a thing. In fact, she was frustrated, or at least that's what I first thought. She was actually frightened and angry simultaneously, talking to herself in harsh, low tones as she left the room and came back a minute later with a cold compress and a blanket. She propped Leti's head on her lap, covered her with the blanket, and put the cold compress on her head. She told me to grab the heart rate monitor from one of the cabinets. There were so many things happening in such a short span of time that I just complied. That's when I first noticed it. When I had looked at my terminal a second ago, before everything had started, it was 7:19, and now it was 7:36. I had lost 15 minutes, and I had no idea how. I just sat down next to Leti's feet, watching her face intently. Sweat gathered at her temples, loosening her baby hairs. Her typical dewy glow was now completely saturated with perspiration. I wanted to do something, anything, to help her. I looked at Sahara, who had her eyes focused on Leti's vitals, and told her, "Sa, we need to get her to a hospital." "We can't," she replied flatly. This is when I almost lost it. "What do you mean? She just had a major panic attack," I replied. And then Sahara raised her voice. "We can't." I freaked out. "Then what do we do?" I raised my voice right back. I don't even know where it came from. I don't know what came over me. But Sahara looked at me for a second and then back at the monitor. Then we just sat in silence for 20 minutes and I was agitated. 20 minutes went by before Leti groaned awake, eyelids fluttering but staying closed as she slightly changed how she was laying down. Her erratic heartbeat and feverish body temp were finally back down in normal ranges. "We can't go to a hospital," Sahara said finally. And with a hardened heaviness, she said the craziest sentence that I feel like I may have heard in my life, directed at me. She told me this: "There are some things I need to tell you. And if you want to stay alive, you listen to me. And after, you'll never come back here." All right. That's it for episode 2 of The Last Siren, Leti's story, titled "Why Won't You Believe Me?" or whatever I change it to between now and uploading. Feel free to like, subscribe, and enable notifications if you're watching this on YouTube, or follow the show if you're listening through a podcast app so you can catch the next episode of Leti's story, tentatively titled "The Truth is a Cage." All right. I'll see you next time. Peace.